Okay, so welcome to this webinar, Human Factors, Putting the User First. So my name is Scott Ewan. I facilitate the Human Factors workstream here in BioPhorum's Drug Delivery Forum. And we have today a webinar focused on human factors, putting the user first. So first of all, to introduce very briefly our speakers, and each of them will get a bigger introduction as we get started, but we have, first off, we have Andy Pidgeon, the Head of Usability at 42 Technology. We have Juanita Lamien, Senior Human Factor Engineer at Regeneron, and Alicia Douglas, Human Factors Leader at Merck. So this is just a very quick intro to BioPhorum for those of you who are not familiar with BioPhorum. BioPhorum is a series of forums, actually 11 forums spanning the biopharma industry, including drug delivery, which is the forum that Loic and myself sit in, and also kind of hosts this webinar. We are a membership organization, as I said, with pharmaceutical and biopharma companies, drug device companies joining us as members to collaborate together on industry-wide issues. We we are not the brains of the outfit. You are the brains. Our members are the brains of the outfit. To identify industry-wide problems or industry-wide opportunities, and we work with our members, who are the industry, to come up with industry-wide solutions to industry-wide problems. Within the Drug Delivery Forum itself, we have a series of work streams. Human factors, you'll not be surprised to hear, is one of those. But you can see the current program we have online. So we have work streams, collaborations, cross-forum teams looking at topics as wide as human factors, essential product performance or EDDOs, risk management, biocompatibility. If you want to know more about that, you can speak to Loic. We are looking at device platform development at the moment as well, and that's a theme that covers all of our teams. We're looking at connected devices, of which a number of the folks who've spoken up today are involved with as well. We're also looking at sustainability, container closure integrity for devices. We also look at companion diagnostics as something that's new starting at the moment, and regulatory insights across the whole of the industry as well. So we are trying very, very hard to kind of meet the needs of the industry. With collaborations with our members, the industry. And if you would like to hear more detail about that, please do reach out to either Loic or myself, and we will be happy to talk to you about more in detail about what we do. So we're going to start with Andy Pidgeon. As I mentioned, he's the head of usability at 42 Technology, human factors consultancy, design consultancy at Cambridge in UK. Andy's a passionate advocate for patient-centric drug design and drug delivery devices. That's a tough one to say, lots of Ds. He argued that whilst innovation in injectors, wearables, and connected health is accelerating, too often it prioritizes flashy features over what patients truly need: reliability, simplicity, and confidence in use. Drawing over 20 years of experience in human factors and industrial design, Andy challenges the industry to ensure every feature earns its place and that empathy, not technology for its own sake, guides development. His core belief is simple: the smartest device is the one that knows when to stay out of the way. So great, great to have you with us, Andy. And without further ado, I will hand over to you. You should be able to wrestle control of the screen and share your slides.
That's great. Well, thanks for the introduction. I think you've pretty much encapsulated my whole talk, so I think it'll be very brief now. So just a quick note about me. Yes, my background is actually as an industrial designer. And then for the last 20 odd years, I've been doing human factors and usability around medical devices. And I'm drawing on a lot of my experience from those years. So what am I talking about today? It's really about putting the user or the patient first and trying to get a feel for what does that mean. And I think it probably means to me having empathy for that user and using that empathy to guide us in what we're doing. So I think we all want to make life better for our users, for the patient, and the keys to that is really easier access to medication and things like treatment at home, something we're all very much focused on, I think. The more difficult we make it, though, for the patients to self-administer, the harder that gets. And this is obviously pretty obvious, but it has quite a few implications in the way we work and the way we design. So the ideal medication is simple to use, it's easy, and that's obviously a given, but with injectables, that's not always as easy to achieve. Um, we ask the users to jump through a lot more hoops than perhaps some of them would be expecting. So oftentimes we think about this in terms of few steps, few easy, intuitive steps. And I've seen a number of briefs over the years which have contained must be no more than one or two or three user steps. And I contend that while it's a good starting point, actually the number of steps is not the important thing. It's actually the intuitiveness of those steps. And you might often find a case where there are 3 or 4 steps which are very obvious to the user, which are much better for them than maybe 1 or 2 fairly unintuitive steps. So I think it's actually not a numbers count. It's so much as an intuition. So, for example, when we go from a prefilled syringe to refrigerating that, to adding a higher viscosity, so longer durations, or to reconstituting, with each of these steps, we're adding more complexity and more ways in which patients can make mistakes or get confused. And every step is basically a potential error. What we see quite often is that these additional steps very quickly become overwhelming for some patients. And we have to remember that for them, we work in this industry and we see these sorts of devices all the time. But for a patient, it might be the first time they've seen something like this. It might be quite scary or quite intimidating. And they're dealing with the repercussions of whatever condition that they're being diagnosed with or treated for. So this is a lot for them to take on in some cases. I talk about adherence. There are lots of numbers you can bandy around about the adherence in injection therapies, and I've seen some as low as 36%. Whatever the true number is, even if it's much higher than that, it's still way lower than we would want it to be. And there are lots of reasons for this, and I'm going to delve into a few of them in a minute. But it is something which I think is probably quite shocking when I look at the number of people we're talking to and how many of them are not either able or willing to follow through on their therapies. So I'm going to think about this as a sort of a patient journey, and how do we make that journey as easy as possible? Now, one of the ways that we've been doing this over the last decade or more is by using smart technology, and this is increasingly going to be a trend. We can use that technology to do lots of things, remind patients, to update clinicians, to track everything through to the cloud. But I think it's also easy for us to get in the trap of defining the problem in terms of sort of the required outcome, looking at adherence as being the goal and using the technology to line up against that. When you've done studies, and I'm sure a lot of you people on this call will have observed studies over the years, you'll see people that you remember, the ones that had arthritic hands that struggled with a Bluetooth, or people who just said, I just want to take my medicine. I don't want to connect it with a phone. And many other sort of anecdotal reasons why what we're asking them to do is more difficult than you might immediately think. And it leads me to believe that we as an industry should learn to do better. We sometimes see in the sort of briefing discussions that some users or user groups that struggle with technology aren't in our target. We've seen this quite deliberately where manufacturers have said, oh, okay, we're going to put a cap on the sort of age or on the ability to work with smartphones or things like that, which is completely understandable. But on the other hand, it's often those people who are the ones that we most want to get to, and hoping to find ways for them to use the device properly is really, almost more important than anything else. So we're building systems that can monitor, that can track, that can optimize. But if we spin it around to my original premise, what our patients are looking for is actually something which is simple, intuitive, and reliable above all else, perhaps. So I put this slide up because it reminds me of an interview that I did a number of years ago with a lady who was in a motorized chair. She suffered from MS, and she was no longer able to do her own injections. It was a lyophilized drug. It was quite a complicated procedure. And what we were testing with her was a automated device. It was quite big and bulky, but it gave her the ability to actually do the entire injection herself. And I just remember the delight in her face that she no longer needed to have her sister come and give her injections. She could take the delivery of the medication back into her own hands. And for me, that was a game-changing interview in many ways. It was, yeah, absolutely. This is what we should be doing. We should be empowering people and working with them. And in her case, the bulk of the device was beneficial because it gave her something more substantial to hang on to. So we can do this by understanding the pain points of people and also being aware that every user is different and every indication has its own differences. So let's go back to adherence again. There are lots of reasons people don't use particularly injection devices. And it's not really because they forget. It's not something you're likely to forget because it's something which is quite a sort of a notable point in your day. It's probably something you're quite scared of. Many of the people that I've spoken to have whole rituals built around taking their medication. They might put something on the radio. They might make themselves a coffee, sit in their favorite chair. There's a whole ritual that they put around it. Having a bleeping LED or something that's going to tell them it's time isn't necessary and it isn't particularly helping. The decision they make about taking the injection is much more about their own personal choices. And I've heard people tell me that they take what I've heard called as medication holidays. They actually feel empowered by not taking an injection. This is often, I think, in the case where you've got a medication which might cause a headache or site irritation or some immediate issue, but it's actually going to solve a longer term benefit. It's going to slow progression of a disease over a number of years. So for them, actually choosing not to take the medication is them taking control of their lives. And so in a perverse sort of way, they feel empowered by taking a choice that obviously we don't want them to take. So what we should be doing is in designing devices which encourage patients to be more adherent. And I think simply reminding them isn't the action we should be taking. It should be about making life easier for them. So I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of sort of the reasons. Pain is one. People obviously anticipate pain more than anything else. Sometimes there's a dexterity issue. Sometimes just the complexity, and we really have to remember the cognitive levels that some of the people we're designing for are often impaired. And convenience. They're not ranked in order, although I suspect the bottom ones are probably some of the biggest ones to deal with here. I'm just going to take a couple of them, and that's complexity. We are doing a great job in some cases of automating key steps. And I think this is where technology can be really, really beneficial. It can do some really great things. What often happens is we then create a more complex device, which gives us the opportunity to do other things. But it's adding other features for them. It's charging, it's connection, it's pairing, data transfer, all of these things which are not adding to the patient experience. They're actually complicating it. The other one I think is quite key is convenience. We often assume that people are going to take their medication because we tell them to, or because it's important that they do. But if you think about a parent who's got a couple of kids running around getting ready for school, at the time that their medication might be due, they've got a lot of other things going on. They're balancing those things. And to them, the most important thing is not going to be their medication. It's going to be getting their kids' lunch done, getting them out of the door, getting whatever other thing that they're going to do that day done. And so finding the space in which they can then have that quiet moment to take their medication is really, really key. And oftentimes, the duration of time it takes to do the medication is a big factor in whether they actually do it, even when that can be down to even a few minutes or even a few seconds sometimes. So the focus I've been talking about can be on the sort of end of the journey, the final adherence. But I'm basically proposing we should be thinking a lot more about the start of the journey and trying to get our head around who the user is. Now, we can't design for individuals, but if you think about it, wouldn't it be better if we could? And perhaps having the mindset of thinking about people as individuals and looking at how we can get better outcomes for them is a good way to at least start the design process. And when we design for people, we're thinking about a disease state. So we might be thinking, okay, we're designing a product for MS, for CF, for diabetes. But what we're actually designing for is a single parent who's juggling 3 jobs, or it's somebody who's afraid of a smartphone, or it's somebody who might also be suffering from arthritis, or anyone or a number of other things. And when we're looking at patients, they are not homogenous. They are all different and all have their own factors. Now, we can design for people who can handle new technology and embrace it. So I'm certainly not advocating simplicity is the be all and end all. But when we think about platform type approaches, we should be aware that we are potentially leaving people behind. It's also easy to be seduced by ecosystems, apps and Bluetooth and gamification and other things, cloud services. And again, nothing wrong with them, but also patients aren't looking for that. They don't care about ecosystems. What they want is a device that they can use with confidence. And similarly, in the interviews I've done with doctors over the years, they really aren't interested in alerts or real time. They don't want the responsibility of chasing people up. And even having data on devices, I've heard people say it breaks down trust if I'm actually interrogating a device and proving my patient is not being honest with me about the timings and the use. They'd much rather actually maintain that trust by asking the question and hoping they get a truthful answer. So, in summary, I think we need to listen better, we need to observe better, and we need to accept that users are messy and they're diverse and they're surprising very often, and try and build this into our thinking as early as possible. I can't end without saying something about AI. AI is obviously going to be everywhere if it's not already. And for me, AI, it's not about analyzing data. Yes, there's lots of things we can gain from data, but maybe, just maybe, we can use that AI to learn from the user themselves. And I think in future generations, devices which understand the particular user that they're talking to, their behaviors and their preferences, just might be a stronger way to interact with patients. Yeah, so in summary, I think the best device is the one that, at least from a user perspective, does less. It's simple, it works, it's trustworthy, and I think that's the device that gets used. So drug delivery devices need to work together to create optimal experiences. And I think this means collaborating as early as possible in the designing of the journey for the user. Thank you very much.
That is fantastic, Andy. Thank you. So we are next moving on to Juanita Lamien, Senior Human Factor Engineer at Regeneron. She is bringing with her over 7 years of experience in the field. Experience lies in designing medical and surgical devices as well as combination products, ensuring they are both safe and effective for use. Juanita has a bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering and a master's degree in industrial and Human Factors Engineering from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Her academic background has provided her with a solid foundation in both technical and human-centric aspects of engineering. Joanita, over to you. Are you happy and able to wrestle control of the screen from me?
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Andy. And morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. So expanding on Andy's insight, really, it's important to emphasize the pivotal role of human factors engineer in putting the user first. And with that let's take a moment to revisit and explore the basis of human factors engineering. Specifically, let's focus on and its integration into the design process for medical devices. So in my presentation today, I'm essentially going to go over the background of human factors and discuss the preliminary human factors activities to undertake, as well as exploring how human factors contribute to device design and ultimately outline some key strategies for successful implementation of human factors. And then I'm going to conclude with a summary of key points. All right, so let's just jump right in. Let's begin with one essential question. What is human factors engineering, or HFE as I like to call it? Human factors engineering is the application of knowledge about human behavior, abilities, limitation, and the characteristics of the users to the design of the product to help ensure that the product is safe and effective for use. Um, so what makes human factors engineering so important in the medical device design? Um, in the context of medical device design, HFE plays a very important role by helping us identify use-related risks, errors, potential hazard, and harm associated with the use of the device. And by addressing these issues, we can reduce errors and minimize the risk of adverse event, product recalls, and ensure safety and efficiency, ease of use, and device efficacy, right? And so human factors engineering also allow us to, and it ensures that our design comply with regulatory standards and align with the industry expectations. Without really incorporating human factors, devices may become counterintuitive, challenging to learn, difficult to use, which again can lead to errors and negatively impact patient safety. Ultimately, it is now being recognized that human factors consideration must be central in the design process. And our experiences, I believe, has now shown that addressing human factors or usability issues as an afterthought is ineffective and often lead to suboptimal outcomes. One other question that we often hear is, well, when should human factors engineering be integrated into the device development process? The answer is very simple. HFE should be integrated as early as possible, right from the beginning of the development process. And addressing human factors early on help us to avoid those risks that I mentioned earlier that may be associated with poor usability, and ensuring that these considerations that we have are ultimately embedded throughout the design process. Um, Early integration also allows us to create a product or a device that is not only safe and effective, but also meets the needs and the expectation of, again, the intended users. This is, again, tied up to putting the user first, right? It provides us with the opportunity to truly understand our users and design a device that is intuitive and is easy for use. So now let's jump into some early human factors activities. What are those activities that we should be performing to integrate HFE early on in the device development process? We always need to consider educating or continue to educate our stakeholders about human factors engineering, create a human factors engineering process, and start conducting early on user research, right? So let me extend on these key 3 points. When we're talking about educating stakeholders about human factors engineering, um, one key aspect about the importance of educating or continue to educate our stakeholders. And when I mention stakeholders, I mention quality engineers, our reg affairs, our med affairs, clinical team, our technical lead, whether it's mechanical, software engineers, all these different team members that we work on a daily basis. Those are our key stakeholders, right? So continuing to educate or educate our stakeholders about HFE involves clearly communicating the value and significance of human factors engineering to them, highlighting how it enhances the overall design and usability of the products. And this is a continuous education. It's not just a one-time education and done, right? And it's equally important to address any misconception or concern that these partners may have about human factors engineering. I think we should also emphasize the benefit of close collaboration with our stakeholders throughout the entire process, as their involvement really is essential for the overall successful implementation of HFE. Now, the next step is to establish a robust human factors engineering process that is continuous, that is measurable, that is seamlessly integrated into the product development. And this involves really creating a human factors integration plan early on that documents how, how how human factors should integrate with other topic, the organization of human factors capabilities, what analysis are we planning on performing, and when and by whom, and outline all those key human factors deliverable that we'll have for that particular program. And this process really involves identifying user needs and objectives, as well as defining our user requirement, right? It also includes working closely with our quality partners or our quality stakeholders on drafting and or updating the risk documentation when it comes to your FMU, your array, preparing all these relevant human factors documentation, and ensuring that um, all the human factors insight inform the design throughout the entire development process. So we also need to start conducting early on user research to guide our development process. And we need to start by collecting human factors data through various observation methods such as ethnographic research, lead review, contextual inquiries, expert reviews, just to name a few that are tailored to the device that we're designing. Additionally, we need to review user complaint if we have a product that is similar that's already on the market. It really is important to review those user complaint and engage in early discussion about feedback gathered by our sales team, our marketing team, our patient-focused team, for example. And uh, also, we need to collaborate with our post-market team to gather, again, like valuable insight that will help us along the line. Um, and this effort really will help ensure a user-centered approach to the development. All right, so now let's jump into how we can contribute effectively to device design through iterative human factor studies. Right. So one of the most effective ways for us to enhance design process is by conducting comprehensive human factors formative studies. And to achieve this, really, it is essential that we develop a robust and thoroughly detailed human factors study protocol that involve clearly defining the objective of our study, drafting and documentation, again, documenting our risk documentation if we have it to ready at that stage, whether it's a UFME or URA, and ensuring that we're recruiting representative users and outlining the specific tasks that we want to test in that study. We also need to describe effectively the study environment and ensuring that we're fully adherent to regulatory and requirement and standards, like the FDA standards and IEC 6 to 360, just to name a few. Next, we want to carry out our human factor study with careful planning and attention to detail. We need to be able to allocate realistic and sufficient time to recruit representative participants. Um, and we also need to make sure that our study material are really available to the study site. We need to really take the time to totally understand the user interface, review any training material if there are any, right? Like so our instruction for use, for example. Um, and we also need to ensure that if we're having these studies executed through vendors, we need to make sure that our moderators and note takers are expert in the field, that they maintain the study quality and focus on gathering high quality data from our participants to serve as a solid foundation for reliable results and execute the study overall in detail um, and complete the full documentation of the study data and results. This is all truly for full transparency and traceability, so we can go back to our stakeholders and communicate these results with them. Which is the next step, right? Is to share those findings from the human factor study with our stakeholders, particularly with our design team, to address any usability error that were identified throughout the studies. These involve discussing all the observed use errors and summarizing the key insight, highlighting the areas for improvement. And in many cases, it really also is important to prioritize these findings based off of the level of urgency and communicate effectively to our stakeholders. Um, Throughout our discussion with our stakeholders, I find it very useful that it helps to emphasize the critical importance of addressing the user needs and ensure that we have a more effective and user-friendly design throughout. Now let's talk about some key steps to implement our human factors recommendations. And I'm going to go through these in more details in my upcoming slide, but these are some of the key steps that I found that I found helpful when we're implementing our recommendations. So let's start with the stakeholders engagement, right? So again, after completing your human factor study, it really is important to present your result to the relevant stakeholders, whether they're in a smaller team or in a larger team, and have this robust discussion about the identified errors, as I mentioned, and the use-related challenges that the participant might have experienced throughout the study. Um, and then when it comes to the recommendation, again, evaluating the impact and feasibility of each suggestion and prioritizing these recommendations, focusing on the change of the design that are likely to have the most significant impact on usability and safety is key. Um, if necessary, organize working sessions with stakeholders, whether it's on a one-on-one or in smaller team or larger team, just to align on priorities and next steps. And from at the end of that study, depending on the result and depending on the changes that were implemented, we may need to consider conducting iterative human factor studies to gather further feedback and ensure that the recommendations are effective and implemented throughout the design process. We also need to ensure that we have a on ongoing education and training for relevant stakeholders. There are some of our stakeholders, depending on the team that we're in, that are familiar or not necessarily as familiar about human factors engineering. So I find it very helpful to continue to educate them and clarify, again, any misconception that they might have about human factors engineering and continue to keep them informed and engaged throughout. Um, and as I mentioned before, continue to perform these iterative human factor studies to refine the design and establish a necessary feedback loop for gathering user input throughout the studies. Um, Use the feedback to implement continuous improvement based off of their recommendation and maintain clear and consistent communication with our stakeholders, again, by keeping the user first and always. Noting that the formative stage ultimately focuses on identifying and fixing this problem throughout the entire development process, and it provides the necessary data for us to and the design changes to ensure that the final product is ready for our summative studies. And this is a time when we will update our UFMEA URA and to reflect those design changes and ensure that the risk controls are adequately addressed, and that we continue to perform HF studies up until the summative study. And as the device approaches the final stage of its development cycle with formative studies completed, we have to have a commercial ready version of the device that is prepared so that we're able to verify that the device is safe and effective for use by executing a human factor study. And after the human factor study is completed, well, we should ultimately analyze the data and compile a final report, those and assess the residual risks, right? And if, for example, there are critical issues or errors that are found, well, we may want to redesign the product and continue perhaps another round of testing to ensure that really all the user needs are met and the risks are minimized. So in conclusion, again, for me, I do really find it very helpful to prioritize education, engagement, alignment with our stakeholders, and start conducting early on user research, um, perform iterative design, device design, human factor studies, ensuring that we're complying with our regulatory standards, and establishing a feedback loop to gather insight and provide actionable feedback based off of the study results. And again, continue to effectively communicate with our stakeholders. Um, um, and ensure that all the human factors activity that are planned throughout the device development process become key, and that they inform the design throughout, and ultimately making sure that the device is safe and effective for use.
Thank you very much, Jonita. Okay, so we'll push on. So next up, we have Alicia Douglas. So thank you, Alicia, for joining us. Alicia is a graduate of the University of Maryland with a bachelor's degree in bioengineering. She's a human factors leader in the device development and technology group at Merck, with over 19 years of experience in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and consumer healthcare industry. Throughout her career, she's focused on devices and combination products, specifically within oral care and oncology. With a strong background in human factors, she's passionate about integrating human factors into the development process to enhance patient safety, usability, and experience. Throughout her career, she's led cross-functional teams in the development of various products that prioritize patient-centric device design, and Alicia believes in the critical importance of understanding user needs and behaviors, driving our commitment to develop solutions that improve health outcomes. Marvelous. So with that, I will hand over to Alicia. Are you able to wrestle control of the screen?
Awesome. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining today. I also want to thank Andy and Janita for wonderful presentations before me, which leads right into mine, which is really how human factors and the users can really influence the development for combination products. So, of course, I have to give the Merck legal standard of this is all my personal views. This is not intended as legal or regulatory advice, but I look forward to your questions. So I'm really going to discuss, again, how Andy mentioned putting the user first. So having that user at the forefront is really the key to bringing drug and device together. Then we're going to talk about, again, how human factors early on in development can really avoid those costly late stage changes. So Janita did a really wonderful job explaining how you can do that. Just going to really hit a little bit more on those early design aspects. And then how device and formulation, as we can partner together to bring that user-centric development into our products, and show some case studies as well. So one of the things that we learned earlier on from Andy was the importance of a user-centric approach. It really starts with that user experience, identifying those needs and even their preferences, and so as well as their challenges. And then with understanding that experience, we can then lean into adherence, right? What's going to help them maintain that adherence, understand about the usability, again, that experience to meet their needs will really help them overcome those challenges, which lead to a better adherence. And with all of that together, leads to a better quality of life. When they're adhering to their medication, it does lead to a better quality of life. So next is for combination products. We really live in a silo, right? We have drug development that really wants to know, hey, tell me what this final device is. And then you have device development that really wants to know, just tell me what your final formulation is. But what is really key in that is to bring it all together through a user-centric development. So we really need to understand the user's journey, which is their indication or disease progression. What is the user profile? Who are those characteristics that they have? Andy mentioned like dexterity, being maybe a single parent, handspan, mental models, right? But then we also need to understand those user needs, right? What is going to really help with their administration? Are they able to understand those instructions that we're providing? What are their specific features? And then brings us back to usability. When we can focus on that, we can have safety and efficacy. We can make sure they can really assess the combination product. And then we can really learn from those characteristics and build a better user interface. And how do you do that? Is through human factors engineering. So with human factors, right, Janita mentioned about the stakeholders earlier. So I'm just going to really quickly show like HF collaborates through across functional teams, right? So these are all our stakeholders who we need to educate, as Janita mentioned, but also bring together early on in the development so they can also understand who our user is. And so we mentioned some opportunities for human factors. And so what is that is really early in that development, we can do that by bringing device and drug together. And if they're hearing it at the same time, what are those user needs? Some of those patient insights, right? And what is that user interface potentially could be? What are some attributes? Maybe a potential device image early on for the drug to understand what its capabilities are. We can really gather that information to help drive what the user can bring to what we can bring to the market for the user. So as I mentioned earlier, we have silos. We have the device specific, where device is thinking of all of these certain aspects, right? and drug specific, but really they're interacting together. And if HF can show how that dosage form affects physical characteristics of the device, for example, or features, and how the route of administration are together, this all aids in our better development. And there's so many more interactions that human factors can show device and drug. And the way we can best show these types of interactions is through a human factors formative. So Janina mentioned the human factors formative and how it's an iterative process. And what we really want to do is bring our representative user group, right? So we have a certain indication, but we need to make sure within that indication, it's like Andy mentioned, it's not just for a single user, right? In that indication, it's a broad breadth of people. So having a large age group, different dexterities, different stages of within that indication is who we need to bring into this formative. Of course, it's going to be with simulated use, so the aspect of pain may not be there, but let's keep that in mind. And then how are we doing this? By bringing our device team and our formulations team, clinical, behind that one-sided mirror. They can also observe any use errors or use difficulties. They're going to also hear the root causes and finding out why. We can ask some knowledge-based questions, but we can also ask subjective feedback during this formative. And that is really key in that development process, because we're going to find out and determine what are the root causes and understand the usability better. So let's jump into some case studies. Some of you might be going through this right now, where the team says, we have a drug that is for IV, and we want to move to subcutaneous administration. We want to change that administration from the clinic to home, or maybe keep it at the clinic and at home, but you know that changing to a sub-Q is going to be high viscosity and potentially a high volume product. So we have these factors to consider. Who and where will the drug be administered? Is it going to be HCPs or is it going to be lay users? What's an appropriate device for this delivery? Formulation characteristics. We already mentioned viscosity, but then that leads to injection force. We also have to deal with, what's this high volume? Is it going to be in a pre-filled syringe, or is it going to be an auto injector? So thinking of this person's indication, can they deal with that grip, right? And there's other features that we need to also understand. So having your team there at this formative, they will really understand and learn about this switch from IV to sub-Q. What is going to go into that? And so one of the things that we can learn from this is really the user needs and technical design requirements, right? It's critical for us to define that. So doing that early on is where we can be. That early interaction with users can really help inform device image selection. Then also having to understand those limits related to design specs, right? What's that injection force? Well, maybe now we can't use a syringe. Maybe we do need an auto injector, right? And then also, let's not forget about that emotional aspect, right? For the intended user. And here, your team can see what that is about and what you're really talking about so that they can help develop that. i.e., formulations can understand about the pain, the grip, specific aspects. Device team can now hear from the intended user. So it's really part of having them. It's really important to have them there. And like we have been mentioning, all of this together is really proactive risk management, understanding those use errors and being able to design out, because we know they probably will not read the label, is one of the ways we can do this. Now let's look at another case study, right? And let's take, for example, formulation, right? So within formulation, they have, we need it to look a certain way. We need to have it feel a certain way. Okay, well, let's ask them some questions, but bring your device team there with you when you're asking these questions and having the user in mind. How does this drug work? Will the users want to use a drug that has a paste-like or it's yellow coloring, right? How will they adhere to it if it's too viscous? Is it going to be injected? Or do we need to think about, is this something they feel that would be more of an oral medication? Hey, do we need any device aspects of this? And what are those device aspects? But also thinking of, hey, this is something different from what they're used to. So what is their mental model? What are their expectations? So bringing the team together in an HF study, we can do that early work with our formulation partners to really understand what is feasible and what is acceptable for the intended users. Again, those subjective feedback questions in that formative is going to help with that. Then you might have heard earlier on about the wealth of data, right? From the complaints and recalls in clinical trials. Use that data also to help formulations understand about this look and feel. Also, what they currently feel is a mental model of this is what I expect this to be. And so this can also aid in that. And also helps with device understanding the delivery method, right? Early interactions with users can inform on that. And our last case study is another liquid suspension, right? So thinking of, are there going to be particles? Will it require suspension? What are critical steps that we need to think of, right? Having all of those in mind. Then talking to the team again, right? We talked about resuspension. What are these characteristics? What does the user need to do? And do they understand timing of resuspension? Then bringing in formulation, what's the stability? If they resuspend it and leave it on the table for a little while, will they have to resuspend? Again, who are the users? Are they parents? Are they caregivers as well? What type of container do we need to have? And what is really good suspension? Again, having the team together in an early study, seeing and assessing this, asking these types of questions really helps. Because when you incorporate HF early into your process and your project strategy, it really brings the team together. Then you can really deal with those use-related requirements. Also, we talked about that stability. Note that what is an analytical test isn't equivalent to use steps. So talking to your team about that, because this is where the user comes in and that team needs to understand that. Again, does your formulation match with the device and the user, right? Making it for the user, keeping them at the forefront and having other teams understand that they need to be at the forefront. And then we talked about clear instructions for use, right? Is it intuitive? Is it easy for them to understand? And so I only have one thing that I'm calling you to action. When you're working with your teams, let's not inherit anything. Let's start influencing by putting the user at the center. And this way you can bring the teams together and when you're incorporating human factors early in the process. Thank you. And any questions?
Awesome. Thank you ever so much, Alicia. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. That is the presentations over.